Hello everyone, this is Mr. Tanner, and for this set of notes we're going to be exploring the carbon cycle, and we're going to look at it in two different ways. First, we're going to draw a diagram and look at how carbon moves between the biosphere, atmosphere, geosphere, and hydrosphere. And then after we've gone through the diagram, we're just going to look at those processes and give definitions to each of the processes involved in the carbon cycle. So let's go ahead and get started. It's important to remember in a cycle there's no real beginning or end. There's no start to it. But I think a nice place to begin our cycle is with in the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. So in the atmosphere we have carbon dioxide. We're going to abbreviate that CO2. And the way that CO2 in the atmosphere gets into the biosphere, so we're going to draw an arrow showing the movement of carbon into these plants, is through the process that plants do to get their food, to get their sugar. That is photosynthesis. So plants can take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then using the energy from light, they incorporate that carbon dioxide into sugars. Sugars contain carbon as well. And now we have that carbon inside the biosphere. So we now have carbon in all of the plants on Earth. And when an animal eats those plants, they take in the carbon as well. And going from plants to an animal, or from one animal to another animal, if we have a secondary consumer, this is called consumption. So now we've looked at two processes: photosynthesis, taking it from the atmosphere to the biosphere; consumption, it stays within the biosphere, but this is just the process of eating. And once it's in an animal, a couple of interesting things can happen. That carbon dioxide, or that sugar really, it's being stored as sugars and proteins and fats, we can use that energy source and we break that down and we produce carbon dioxide gas again. We concentrate that carbon dioxide gas in our lungs and then we breathe it out back into the atmosphere. And this is a process called respiration, or cellular respiration. So when that carbon's inside an animal, we breathe out carbon dioxide, and that goes back into the atmosphere. So that's one pathway for the carbon once it's inside an animal. If that animal happens to die, we also have decomposition. And decomposition can send carbon into the air. The decomposing bacteria or fungus and other animals that do decomposition release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But not all of the carbon in the animal will be decomposed. So when it dies, some of it will go into the geosphere. If there's less decomposition, more ends up in the geosphere. It ends up in the rocks when an animal dies. Mostly we get carbon in the geosphere from plants, actually. All of our coal that we burn for energy came from ancient forests that were buried without being decomposed. And over time they kind of went through a metamorphosis process, like metamorphic type rock, and became coal. And we're going to pretend this building is a factory, because when factories burn coal or natural gas or petroleum type products, those are all fossil fuels, and the burning of that, right, it creates smoke, and that also releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and that burning process is called combustion. So combustion is the burning of some sort of material, and then you end up with carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And that can happen not just from factories and humans, but right? Forest fires. So if the forest catches on fire, the burning of that wood also releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and that's still an example of combustion. And then the last real process here in the carbon cycle is the fact that atmospheric carbon can be dissolved into water. Water can hold dissolved carbon dioxide. It ends up making the water more acidic. It forms carbonic acid. And water, or carbon dioxide rather, that's dissolved in water can vaporize out. It can just leave the water back into the atmosphere. And these two processes together of dissolving into the water, leaving the water, is known as carbon exchange. So that's just carbon exchange, carbon gas exchange, either one, between water and the atmosphere. So this is our diagram of the carbon cycle, and then next we're going to go through the processes of the carbon cycle to make sure we understand everything that's happening. All right, so let's look at the processes now in a little bit more detail for the carbon cycle. And you're going to be responsible for writing down these processes in your notebook. So next to the diagram, you should have that list of processes. I want you to write the definition of the process, which I've already typed in here on the slide. And I also want you to add what I'm going to be adding, which is how the carbon is moving. So between which of Earth's four spheres is that carbon going? So this should be a pretty short set of notes for you to write down. There's no paper for it, but make sure you are including everything on the list. So we'll start with photosynthesis. The definition for that is just the process by which plants take in and use carbon dioxide. We've gone over photosynthesis in more detail this year, so we'll just leave it at that. The process by which plants take in and use carbon dioxide. And for photosynthesis, that is carbon going from the atmosphere to the biosphere. So in photosynthesis, carbon goes from the atmosphere to the biosphere. Next is consumption, which is just eating, right? Consumption is eating in general. So you can eat for energy, you can eat for carbon, you can eat for nitrogen. It's always the same. But in this case, since it's the carbon cycle, we'll say eating in order to gain the carbon that animals need. And animals eat living things. So this stays within the biosphere. We're going from the biosphere to the biosphere. Not every process moves carbon to a different sphere. Cellular respiration, again, we've gone over that in some more detail earlier in the year. This is where we break down sugars and proteins to get our energy source. And as a byproduct of that, carbon dioxide is made. So cellular respiration is just organisms using carbon compounds for energy. But as a result, carbon dioxide is made. So this goes from the biosphere to the atmosphere. We eventually breathe out through our mouths or nose that we concentrate that carbon dioxide in our lungs. We breathe it out. It ends up back in the atmosphere. When an organism dies, whether it's a plant or an animal, different organisms will help to decompose that once living thing. So decomposition is the breaking down of dead organisms. And this also goes mostly from the biosphere to the biosphere. But then those decomposers do cellular respiration, and then it ends up back in the atmosphere eventually. So decomposers are organisms. They're eating essentially to help break down that dead body or that dead organism, if it's a plant or a tree, whatever it is. And then those organisms respirate and release their carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So when things decompose, eventually that carbon ends up back in the atmosphere. But it's worth noting that not all of an organism decomposes, and what's left over eventually becomes a part of the geosphere. So the less decomposition there is, the more carbon ends up in the geosphere. And the reason we have such a large amount of coal is these forests, these wooden tree forests of the Carboniferous period, when they would die, there wasn't decomposers that could break down wood at this point. That hadn't evolved yet. So these massive amounts of carbon in these trees were just completely entering the geosphere. And over time, they went through, heat and pressure, and they became like a metamorphic rock, which is coal. It's a really, really carbon dense rock, which is great for burning to produce heat. Unfortunately, it also produces a lot of carbon dioxide, which brings us nicely to combustion. Because we take all of that coal, or not all of it, but a large amount of it, we burn it to boil water. That boiling water produces steam. That steam creates pressure, and that pressure can turn a turbine, which produces electricity. So the reason why fossil fuels are great for making electricity is because they're great for producing heat, and we have to boil water to move a turbine. So burning of carbon-based fuels to produce heat, electricity. This goes from the geosphere to the atmosphere. And the reason why this can be so problematic towards the balance of the carbon cycle is a lot of these top processes that we talked about, like photosynthesis, that happens all the time. Carbon is moving in and out of those plants really rapidly. It doesn't take a long time. But when carbon ends up in the geosphere, it usually stays there for millions or hundreds of millions of years. It's a trap, right? The geosphere is a trap in this carbon cycle. And what humans have done is taken all this trapped carbon and just in mass amounts released it back into the atmosphere. And it's at a level where the carbon cycle is no longer balanced. Plants can't take in the amount of carbon that we are releasing. So the carbon cycle is not balanced. That carbon is building in higher and higher and higher concentrations in the atmosphere. And since it's a greenhouse gas, the Earth is warming. It's trapping in that heat. So these are the processes of the carbon cycle, and hopefully this, along with the diagram we did, are helping this make sense. Thanks for watching.